Hello, everybody, and happy National Day of Reason. My name is Suzanne Perry. I'm Vice President of HumanistsMN, one of the sponsors of today's event. Just a reminder that the National Day of Reason, which was set up to counter the National Day of Prayer, honors the principles of secular lawmaking, separation of religion and government, and public policy based on science, evidence, and reason. We weren't able to have a big showing at the state capitol like we did last year due to the health crisis. Nevertheless, we have a great program today. We've got a couple of speakers who are Zooming in from Washington, a number of local advocates who will explain why the Day of Reason principles are important for their issues, and some Minnesota legislators who will be chiming in by video. We do have one program change to announce. Rachel Lazar, president of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, is unable to join us this morning because of an emergency. However, we have a very able substitute, Dina Scher, who's assistant vice president of public policy for the organization. Just a word about the format. Our speakers are gathered in a Zoom room, so to speak, but you're watching a live stream of their presentation. Please note that there's a chat area on the screen, and you can use that to get into conversations with other viewers, or note the Ask a Question feature. And please do pose questions, which we will funnel to our speakers toward the end of the event. With that, let's move to our first speaker, Harlan Garbell, who's president of HumanistsMN. He'll be followed by representatives of the two other humanist organizations that are sponsoring this event. Okay, Harlan. Unmute yourself, Harlan.
Oh. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. There you
Thanks, Suzanne. Hi, everyone. I'm here today to talk with you about the National Day of Reason and why it is so important for people who value science and reason to participate. The First Amendment of the Constitution states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The authors of the First Amendment were students of history and were well aware that if you wanted to create democratic institutions, you could not prohibit people from freely following their consciences in matters of belief, or for that matter, non-belief. But equally important was that the founders were adamant that no single religion should dominate the public sphere. They were also philosophers and scientists who keenly understood how one dominant religion could extinguish free thought and scientific inquiry. In the current political landscape, it is regrettable that much of what passes for public policy in the United States is generated by a failure to rely upon science-based evidence. This is harmful to the people, the planet, and corrodes our democracy. That is why HumanistsMN believes that the constitutional mandate for the separation of religion and state should be defended vigorously. There are real-life tragic consequences when reason and science are cast aside and replaced by public policy promoted by faith-based groups. So-called Christian nationalists are now having an outsized influence on one of our major political parties. This party controls the executive branch, one house of the Congress, and in the view of many, the Supreme Court. One of the malignant consequences of the influence of Christian nationalists on public policy is the failure of our lawmakers and the current administration to take seriously the threat to the environment resulting from climate change. Although scientists are almost unanimous in predicting severe consequences for people and the planet as a result of climate change, our government is stymied in developing an appropriate national response because of the anti-science bias of the Christian right. The current COVID-19 pandemic is another situation where scientists' warnings, even within the government, went unheeded. Many knowledgeable healthcare policy experts believe that if these warnings were taken seriously, several thousands of lives could have been spared. Here in Minnesota, religious ideology has also intruded in critical policy areas such as reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, and medical aid in dying. So, In solidarity with the free thought community across America, please join us in advocating for reason, science, and the separation of religion and state. Thank you.
Thank you, Harlan. We're now going to move to Reverend Kelli Clement, Assistant Minister of First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis.
Good morning. Thank you, Suzanne. And thank you, Harlan, for that wonderful introduction. It may seem funny on a day of reason to have somebody with Reverend in front of their name. And I include this here because I think at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, we thread a middle path between the completely secular and what it means to be organized as a congregation. First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis is a member of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations, and we are an intentionally and radically inclusive congregational humanist community. We claim ourselves as the birthplace of congregational humanism. We are a curious, thoughtful, and passionate congregation, and we care for each other and the world. We serve the world through education, advocacy, and service for social justice. We're doing good without God. I want to particularly note that FUS is one of the two named plaintiffs in a lawsuit challenging the state of Minnesota and the unconstitutional mandates in Minnesota law that restrict access to abortion. In particular, FUS is challenging the mandate that states that fetal tissue that is the result of abortion or miscarriage must be disposed of by burial or cremation. This is a mandate that has nothing to do with public health or medical safety for any reason. It is purely rooted in a religious understanding of the concept of when does life begin. And we say that this is an infringement on our religious liberty. What I have learned in the process of our becoming a plaintiff in this is that the Minnesota statute that protects religious freedom is much more robust than the statute in the U.S. Constitution. And so we have a much better claim to our religious freedom and liberty. So that lawsuit is slowly, ever so slowly, wending its way through the courts. You'll hear more about the efforts. We're also a community partner with UnRestrict Minnesota that's addressing several of the laws, the mandates in Minnesota law. But this one in particular, we feel really strongly about because we are science-based, because we are fact-based. There's lots to say about the COVID-19 crisis and the way that, as Harlan said earlier, as it's affecting the ways that religious communities look at it. But I am especially taken by the organizations that he talked about, or the people, the categories of people that he talked about: LGBTQ people, reproductive health, and the rights in dying. All of these are the effects of one religion, one way of thinking to control the human body. And we say no to that. So I'm delighted to be a part of this conversation today, and I'm eager to hear what other people have to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelli. We're now going to move to Richard Logan, who's Outreach Coordinator for Emet, the Minnesota Congregation for Humanistic Judaism. Richard.
Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you all for being here. It's on this very, very important day. And of course, we're here to stand up not just for science and reason, but for democracy. I'm also here as a representative for the movement of Humanistic Judaism and the Society for Humanistic Judaism. It's been my honor the past several years to be the board president there. Humanistic Judaism is the movement in Judaism grounded in Jewish culture, not in the religion of Judaism. So we're non-theistic. Our purpose is to keep Jewish culture and its many strong values alive, and vital values like tikkun olam, repairing the world, which is one of the things we feel we're doing here today. Ethics, working for social justice, and the kinds of human rights people are already mentioned. The Society for Humanistic Judaism is the congregational arm of the Humanistic Judaism movement, and its mission is to provide meaningful Jewish community for the growing numbers of secular non-theistic Jews in North America. Another cornerstone of Humanistic Judaism is science and reason, that all knowledge and actions in the world must be based on evidence and research, and that all knowledge and ideas must also pass the test of logic or reason. A further cornerstone of Humanistic Judaism and the society is democracy, people reasoning together and making decisions for the common good based on evidence and reason. One of our heroes in all of this is the philosopher Baruch Spinoza, and I'm sure everybody here has read all of Spinoza in the original. That cornerstone led the Society for Humanistic Judaism to undertake an initiative for the entire Jewish community, not just for our segment of it, called Jews for Secular Democracy, which seeks to mobilize all Jews to work to keep American government neutral or secular on matters of belief. The Jewish world has been very active in those regards for generations. This matters greatly today because of the efforts of fundamental Christians to get control of levers of government, with some tragic success, and make their beliefs on abortion, LGBTQ rights, and many other human rights into the policies of government. And I do want to add that Rachel Lazar, the CEO of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, was the first person in this country to be given the Constitutional Defender Award by Jews for Secular Democracy. Thank you all. Looking forward to a really, really interesting and good conversation with people.
Thank you, Richard. We're now going to hear from some legislators, not in person, but they took the time to record some video messages for us. So take it away.
Hi, I'm Senator John Marty, and very pleased to be with you, at least remotely, for this Day of Reason. It's something that we, as Americans, have to speak up for. Something I thought we wouldn't have to these days. I thought that we had learned these lessons, that we understood the difference between people's private beliefs, matters of conscience, and the public law, and the things that everybody in our society have to follow. This is very disturbing to see. There was a recent Pew Research Center poll that said half of all Americans, only half, 50%, believe that Bible and other religion scriptures should have impact. It should have no impact on our laws. Fully half of the public, half of a quarter of that being strongly believe that biblical scriptures and religious documents should have a heavy influence on our laws, affecting 100% of the public. And that's disturbing. It goes very much against what the nation's founders, what Thomas Jefferson and others said. So we have to fight against that. And the fact that we have that kind of views in there has warped our whole description of how we address issues. Climate change, probably the most serious threat to our planet, to human civilization altogether. In this crisis of coronavirus time, it may be hard to see other things as bigger threats. But clearly, climate crisis is more serious than that. And yet we're doing so little as a nation about that. And I think it's largely because some people coming from some religious mindset decided that their religion determines what science is about. They determine what climate's going to be. They determine what other things are going to be. So we don't have to worry about what happens around to the world around us. Well, politicians, as Wendell Berry once said, politicians and the public sometimes think we control so much, but Mother Nature has the last hand. Mother Nature is the one who has the final vote, and Mother Nature does not compromise with our stupidity. So I think we need to speak out. We need to fight for science-based public policy. We have to fight for addressing this climate threat. We have to fight for a world that cares for all of us, not one that somebody's personal religious beliefs are going to impose on other people. That's why I really am pleased to be with you for the Day of Reason, really pleased at what you're doing and speaking out on this. And thank you, and look forward to continuing to work with you.
Hi, I'm Representative Todd Lippert. I represent the Northfield, Lonsdale, Montgomery, and Dundas areas in southeast Minnesota. I'm also an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, and I come to politics through my faith. But I'm in a tradition that sees no conflict between science and religion, no conflict between reason and faith. In fact, we see that if we're going to be practicing the Great Commandment and following that Great Commandment in Christianity to love God and love neighbor, we'd better be learning all we can about the world we inhabit and learning all we can about who we are as human beings and taking that information in so that we can treat one another in loving and caring ways. This is especially true with COVID-19 right now. We have to be listening to scientists and public health experts as we learn more about this disease and learn how we can slow the spread of this virus, care for one another, and especially care for those who are most vulnerable right now. I'm also in a tradition that traces its lineage back to the Pilgrims who sailed across the Atlantic searching for religious freedom, trying to get away from the sort of religious persecution that was happening in post-Reformation Europe, where it didn't matter the faith you practiced. Depending on the monarch who was coming into power, you could be persecuted for your faith. And so the founders, as they were establishing a state that was neutral towards religion, wanted to create space where Christians could practice, but others could practice their faith too. So Christians, whether Catholic or Protestant, could express their faith, Jews could express their faith, and Muslims too, or those who were following their freedom of conscience and choosing to practice no faith at all, that they could live freely as well. So for politicians who are people of faith, I think it's important that we are asked, how do you feel about someone who practices a faith that's different than yours? Will you honor them? How do you feel about someone who chooses to practice no faith at all? Will you honor them and make space for them? If so, then they are consistent with the spirit of the founders who wanted to create space for multiple faith expressions or no faith expression at all. And that's something that's at the heart of who we are as a country.
Hi, I'm Mike Freiberg. I'm the state representative for Crystal, Golden Valley, New Hope, and Robbinsdale. Thank you so much for your commitment to the separation of church and state and to make sure policy decisions are grounded in science. We're living in the midst of the worst pandemic in 102 years, and it's never been more important to base policy decisions on science. Anti-science policymakers harm the public by denying the fact of climate change, by touting disproven links between vaccines and autism, and by supporting harmful practices like conversion therapy. Just yesterday, the President of the United States basically suggested that tanning beds and injecting Lysol can cure COVID-19. It's time for us to recommit ourselves to science-based policy and to support candidates that support science. Your group can help play a key role. Please contact your legislators and tell them to base their decisions in science. Please work to elect candidates that support science. So with that, I just thank you all for being here, and I want to wish you a happy Day of Reason.
Well, hello, everybody. This is State Representative Raymond Dehn coming to you through recorded video here, and I hope that all of you are doing the best you can to get through what has truly been some real difficult times over the past few weeks, and certainly appear that this may go on a little while, that we'll be dealing with this current crisis. I'm excited to be chatting with you because I'm one of those people that really believe that science matters. I really believe that, you know, how people go about their daily lives and make their decision is what's critical. I believe that humanity and people have good in them and will do that without having to have necessarily a doctrine or something that drives them to make some of the decisions that they make. You know, it might be a little bit easier, but that's okay. I think for those of us who believe in data, believe in science, and believe that, you know, the world is made of wonderful people doing wonderful things, that we can actually accomplish a lot. And of course, we're finding out more and more people are, becoming public with their beliefs or their non-religious beliefs. I think one of the great things about the humanist and about some of the other folks is it gives us a place to come together, which is the role that many religions play, to really talk about those issues that we believe are important to us and those things we value in the world. So I just really appreciate all of you continue to do the work that you are doing and connecting with people so that our voices actually have a voice that can be heard. It's been amazing to watch some of these press conferences by the president these last few weeks and see the scientists get up after he spoke and really clarify what he said in a way that sort of makes some sense. So again, thank all of you for the work you do and the engagement. And I hope that you all are hanging in there. We're all going to get through this and we'll come out better on the other side. So thanks again.
Okay, well, thanks very much to the legislators who appeared in this video. It's a busy time of year for them, especially given the pressure to address the COVID-19 crisis. So we really appreciate them taking the time to greet us today. We're going to move on now to our local advocates who will talk about why Day of Reason principles are important to them. And we're starting with Teresa Nelson, Legal Director, ACLU of Minnesota.
Good morning, everybody. It's an honor to be with you today, and I want to thank you all for taking the time to attend this event. The ACLU of Minnesota's mission is to protect the constitutional rights of all Minnesotans, and that includes both the U.S. and the Minnesota Constitution. So it was great to hear from the Reverend about how they are using the Minnesota Constitution to support abortion rights. We've been hard at work advocating for the protection of civil liberties during this challenging time. This is an unprecedented pandemic, and science and reason have never been more important than they are today. And as a constitutional lawyer, I'll just take a minute to tell you why. So first of all, public health crises often do justify some governmental actions that would not be lawful in other times. And this crisis is no different. The governor's executive orders relating to the pandemic have limited our movements. They've limited our ability to assemble in large groups, which is protected by the First Amendment. They've limited our ability to associate with family and friends. They've limited people's ability to come together in this time. And anytime the government's actions infringe on the exercise of fundamental rights, the government has to show that their actions are the least restrictive means of serving a compelling interest. That is the standard that a court will use to assess those restrictions on people's constitutional rights. And protecting people's lives and flattening the curve, as they would say, is likely a compelling government interest. And so the question is, are the governor's actions the least restrictive means of serving that interest? And when you look at that question, it is absolutely critical that government officials follow the recommendations of public health experts and that they ground their decisions in science and reason and not politics or xenophobia. And it's not enough to simply ground those decisions in science, but we need to constantly reassess and reevaluate those restrictions because our knowledge changes. Our knowledge about the disease and facts on the ground are changing every day, and our understanding evolves, and public health recommendations are also evolving. And so it's important to continually reassess and make sure that any restrictions that the government imposes, again, are still have a sound basis in science and reason. My time is quite short, but I will say one other thing is that when we are responding to this pandemic, we need to make sure that we are not leaving behind vulnerable.
Oh, I think we've lost the sound there. Terry said sometimes her internet went out. So we'll try and get back to her and let her finish up when she can. Meanwhile, we'll move on to Rebecca Thoman, who is campaign manager for Doctors for Dignity at Compassion and Choices. Rebecca.
Thank you. Thank you all for letting me be here today. I really want to emphasize that I'm here to help you all put your principles into action. And I thank the Humanists because you've been one of our most active partners in advancing the End of Life Option Act. The End of Life Option Act, and by the way, Representative Mike Freiberg is our chief author in the House, is modeled after the Oregon Death with Dignity law, and it would allow a terminally ill person of sound mind to be able to ask for, receive, and ingest a medication for a peaceful death if their suffering becomes intolerable. And it's very much about patient-driven care. It's about really medical aid in dying in some ways is the ultimate religious freedom for us because it's a battle that's happening right here in our state right now. The good news is that even people of faith support medical aid in dying. I have some visuals. So even a survey of a Christian survey group showed that majorities of every group of faith actually find medical aid in dying to be a moral value, a moral act. But our lawmakers are not reflective of the general public, and that's our big problem. The bad news is that, in fact, in Minnesota, medical aid in dying is a crime. And we're working to change that. We would like Minnesota to be the first state in the Midwest to join the other 9 states and Washington, D.C. to authorize medical aid in dying for qualifying patients. And I have to also note that the very first Death with Dignity law was written in the basement of a Unitarian church in Portland, Oregon. So the most important thing you could do right now, if you're saying, great, I support this, I want to help, what can I do? Right now, the most important thing you can do is get involved in the elections. And by that, I mean, ask the candidates. We are doing an Ask the Candidate program from May 20th, as soon as the session is out, until November 3rd. And we're trying to get every single person to talk to their state, House, or Senate candidates about medical aid in dying, say why you support the bill, educate them about what it means, and let them know that this matters to people. Because what happens in the future depends on November 3rd. So we can lobby all we want, but lobbying's after the fact. Right now is when candidates are listening to us. So if you would like to get involved, I urge you to join Compassion and Choices web email list. It's a pretty simple email, compassionandchoices.org. Sign up. We're going to be having a webinar next month about how we ask the candidate and how we are going to bring our issue to awareness of the candidates running for office this year and how we are going to advance the End of Life Options Act next year. And I wanted to say one final note, which is that we know that this drive to suppress end of life options is coming from religious groups. The groups that are most opposed to us are the Catholic Church and the Right to Life organizations. They're not going to argue religion. They're not going to say, well, this is immoral. What they're going to say is, oh, this could be harmful to people with disabilities, or this could be, we could start targeting Black people. So they're going to come up with a lot of different things that they're going to say about it. They're not going to take head on the discussion about religion. And so saying we have this right, this religious freedom, is not an argument that sells. So I encourage you to get involved in Compassion and Choices, and we can talk to you about the best way to talk about and advance this issue that respects people and can help us get ahead. So thank you for the time.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Terry apologizes for cutting out, and the last thing she was going to say was, we need to ensure that our response to this pandemic must ensure that we do not leave our most vulnerable and marginalized neighbors behind. Now we'll move to Jesus Lucero, who is Greater Minnesota and Faith Coordinator for OutFront Minnesota.
Hello, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be joining y'all today. My name is Jesus Lucero, as was just shared, and I use they, them pronouns. And I have the pleasure of serving as the organizing and policy coordinator for Greater Minnesota and Faith Communities for OutFront Minnesota. Day of Reason holds a pretty special place in my heart because roughly around this time last year, I had recently joined the OutFront team, and this was the first opportunity that I had to speak in my new role. And I really can't imagine a place that I'd rather be than here with all of you today. For those that don't know a ton about the work that we do at OutFront, we are the largest LGBTQ civil rights organization in Minnesota working towards the full inclusion and equity of all. We believe in a world where all LGBTQ people are free to be who they are, love who they love, and live without fear of violence, harassment, or discrimination. Now, a lot has changed in that year, and that's definitely not news. Here we are in a virtual world, and yet we continue to adapt and change to the state of things. But that's the beauty of being human. Last year, I spoke about our fight to end conversion therapy, and we continue to fight for that same priority this legislative session. And more broadly, we continue to organize with our movement partners all across the country in order to abolish the practice at a federal level. The lives of LGBTQ people, and more particularly the lives of trans people of color, continue to be debated and weighed. Most recently, we worked in coalition with lawmakers, community organizations, and advocates to pass a piece of legislation nicknamed the Hate Crimes Bill that would strengthen the protections for marginalized communities by demanding tighter reporting structures and increased trainings for law enforcement. It's no lie that this piece of legislation is important for the lives of many, but now, more than ever, we're seeing an increase in hate crimes towards Asian American communities due to the overwhelming misinformation and stereotypes surrounding COVID-19. We need protections grounded in facts and reality now. Looking ahead, we're continuing to challenge the harmful rhetoric perpetuated by faith institutions who continue to say and act in anti-LGBTQ ways, but hide behind the guise of religion. We know we have a long way to go, but it's supporters and members of organizations and allied organizations who make that whole work a lot easier. As they say, many hands and all that. If you're curious to learn more about OutFront, I urge you to visit us on any of the social media channels. You can find us at OutFront.MN or visit our website at outfront.org. We have a plethora of resources, events, and volunteer opportunities for folks to plug into. I'm incredibly excited to stand with all three organizations who made this day possible. I stand with facts, reasons, and science. I stand with those who believe in a better tomorrow. And today, I'm incredibly excited to stand with all of you. Thank you so much for having me here today, and I very much appreciate your time. Thanks.
Thanks, Jesus. We're now going to move to Yuval Hartford, co-field team manager at UnRestrict Minnesota. And Yuval, I'm going to unmute you. Can you unmute yourself? There we go. There we go.
Hold on. It looks like we were having a little mute tag battle. That was fun. Yeah, really switching it up on me. Okay. Hi everyone. I'm happy to be here today and able to speak with all of you on National Day of Reason. UnRestrict. Oh, did I get muted there? Oh, sorry. I got a bunch of weird notifications. UnRestrict Minnesota is a coalition of organizations like Take Action, First U, NCJW, Asian American Organizing Project, Whole Women's Health, and Our Justice, Medical Students for Choice, and so many others. A lot of people have gotten on board with this campaign, and we are focusing primarily at this moment on educating Minnesotans, both citizens and legislators, about the abortion restrictions in our state. Our aims are to have legislators address these issues as we continue educating them at town halls, like we did on Reproductive Freedom Lobby Day, and like we do at our trainings. Minnesota is a pretty peculiar situation. While 70% of Minnesotans are in favor of having abortion be safe, legal, and readily available in people's communities and without stigma, we have several of the same restrictions that exist in Alabama, Georgia, and other places that are often deemed not terribly progressive when it comes to reproductive health care. And in some cases, we have some that they don't even have, such as the mandated cremation or burial of fetal remains. it is purely rooted in stigmatizing people who decide to have an abortion and who do have an abortion, in the hopes of inciting guilt in them, as well as increasing the costs of having an abortion, so that it is just that much more difficult to access. It is not, and these restrictions, they're never actually about healthcare, right? It's about controlling people's bodies and controlling the decisions that they make about their bodies. And I know what stands out for me as a mostly observant Jew. The restrictions, the mandates, the laws that exist in Minnesota regarding abortion access privilege this very specific brand of Christianity and a very specific theological framework that exists within that brand of Christianity, right? So it's not even close to representative of all Christian beliefs. That would be absurd. And it has a specific idea of when life begins, but that is not shared across all religions or all sects and denominations of Christianity. And as a Jew, our interpretations of Jewish law exist within something called the Talmud, where rabbis discuss the context, validity of arguments, etc. And within the Talmud, it has been ruled that for us, broadly, that life doesn't begin until, big air quotes, first breath, whatever that meant to the rabbis at that time. And while I'm not personally a Talmudic expert, nor do I even necessarily agree with all aspects of this excerpt. Ooh, too many words in there. Particularly how it views the bodies of pregnant peoples, women especially, and it's still ultimately about control with how it's framed in the Talmud. And, so goes the joke, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. And for UnRestrict Minnesota, what matters most is that people who have made the decision to have an abortion ought to be able to have one free from stigma. It ought to be affordable, available in their communities, and free from any restrictions. Thanks, everybody, for letting me talk with y'all today.
Thanks, Yuval. A final local speaker is Teresa Bulander, who's a board member at Camp Quest North.
Hello, I'm really excited to be here today. Camp Quest North is a summer camp that serves young people ages 8 to 17. It also provides an inclusive and secular community that is based on humanist principles, and including the of separation of church and state, science, and reason. Our goal is to encourage and empower young people to think critically and live compassionately. Now, for camper and counselor safety, we have canceled our 2020 sessions. And we, our staff, and our families are grieving this loss. We are a largely volunteer-run organization, and our volunteers are already busy building a free virtual summer camp experience for our campers and others, as well as opportunities for all of us to digitally connect throughout the summer. And so I just ask that you remember that this summer is going to be tough for summer camps, because they are always so excited to provide those transformative experiences that build community among so many young people. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Our website is campquestnorth.org.
Thank you, Teresa. Now we're going to move to our keynote speakers who are joining us from Washington, D.C. They both help lead Americans United for Separation of Church and State, a group that's at the forefront of the battle to ensure that government does not favor one religion over another or the religious over the non-religious. This has been a particularly busy time for them, as you will hear. Sarah Galuli is Vice President for State Outreach and Engagement and will discuss the coronavirus and church-state separation. Dina Scher is Assistant Vice President of Public Policy and will discuss religious influence on government in the Trump era. Just a little bit about our two speakers. Sarah's bio on the AU website says, Sarah works every day for religious freedom because as a Quaker and a queer, non-binary white co-conspirator from the South, Sarah knows that their liberation is bound up with yours. Before joining AU, Sarah served as Director of Political Strategy and Advocacy at the ACLU of North Carolina. Before that, she worked for Planned Parenthood for 10 years at the state and national levels. And while serving at Planned Parenthood Federation of America in Washington, Sarah led a nationwide contraceptive equity policy project. Hold on one second. I'm going to read to you what Sarah wrote this morning about Dina, who, as I said earlier, is a last-minute substitute. We really appreciate her coming on board. Dina is our senior policy attorney and federal lobbyist. Dina's been at AU for more than 10 years, and she also served on the national office of the ACLU as part of their Religious Freedom Project. Dina's on the front lines of fighting back against the Trump administration's countless efforts to roll back separation of religion and government. Thank you for that. Okay, Sarah, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm so disappointed I can't be with you in the Twin Cities today, but am delighted to be able to join you by video. As Suzanne mentioned, I'm a Southerner, but I lived for over a decade of my life in the Midwest in Missouri. And so we're your Midwestern cousins who make our hot dishes out of Rotel and Velveeta instead of tater tots and canned soup. But I feel a real kindredness to all Midwesterners. And so I'm so glad to be with you. At AU, we work every day to defend separation of religion and government. That's how we protect religious freedom for all. We do that work in courts and in Congress and in communities across the country so that folks can practice any religion they want or no religion at all, so long as we aren't harming others, because that is the religious freedom found in our Constitution. You've been hearing a lot during COVID about the medical issues and the economic issues and increasingly the political issues, but less about some of the constitutional issues that are coming up. This is, in some ways, I like to say, exactly the moment that our founders planned for. Moments in our country when we are facing extreme stress and upheaval and deep questions of who we are and how we will be in the world. The Constitution is the place that we look to, that our founders intended to bring stability, to offer a North Star, so that even in times of crisis, all of our rights would be protected. So today, I'm going to be talking about how this crisis is creating extraordinarily complex questions about separation of religion and government, how folks have been responding both in states and at the federal level. And at AU, we really believe that now is the time to lean into the protections in our First Amendment that so many of our speakers have spoken eloquently about. I'm going to be talking a little bit about mass gatherings. You may have heard some about this in the news. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the stimulus package and also about public education and how those issues are intersecting with separation of religion and government right now. So I'm going to start with mass gathering bans. As one of our speakers from the ACLU previously said, it would be unusual and unconstitutional in ordinary times to ban gatherings of people, including for worship. But as you all know, we're now living not in ordinary times, but in extraordinary times. And we have to find new ways to balance public health and safety alongside religious liberty. So when we talk about mass gatherings, one thing that I like to clarify first is that we're really talking about three different mechanisms in terms of these executive orders that governors are issuing in order to decrease public transmission of the coronavirus. The first one is straight up mass gathering bans. These are about the number of people who are allowed to gather in both public and private. This was the first wave of executive orders that we saw. There's also something called stay home orders. Another speaker referenced these. These are the orders that just tell people to stay home unless they have special circumstances. And then there's a sort of third mechanism within these executive orders around closing or placing restrictions on non-essential businesses. In Maryland, where I live, outside of the District of Columbia, we have all three of those in place. And I'll talk a little bit more about what's in place in Minnesota in just a minute. And mostly the church state issues that are popping up are in the context of those mass gathering bans and whether or not and how they should apply to houses of worship like synagogues and churches and mosques and others. And I'm not going to hide the ball on this. We at AU believe strongly that those orders not only can, but must include houses of worship. And the good news is these orders are in place in about 50 states. They look differently everywhere, but in 34 of 50 states, governors agree with Americans United and with the Constitution, and they have not exempted churches from these gathering bans. And a recent poll actually showed that 90% of houses of worship have readily canceled their in-person services, whether or not there was an order in place in their community. But in about 8 states that have these clear bans on mass gatherings, we've seen exemptions, explicit exemptions for houses of worship, including in some blue states like Colorado and Connecticut that allow houses of worship to not abide by the mass gathering bans that apply to every other kind of gathering. In those places where we've seen governors exempt houses of worship, even in places where governors haven't exempted them, we often see small numbers of houses of worship defying those orders, and the consequences are horrific, especially when we think about the disparity of this illness on the most vulnerable in our community, as one of our speakers said. Having defiance of these orders or having groups refuse to comply with them puts us all at risk. And so that's really where the Constitution comes in. There's the science reasons, and I can hear all the reasonable humans all the way up in Duluth sort of groaning about the way that the science has been disregarded here. And there's constitutional issues that are being disregarded. So the first principle that's important around these mass gathering bans is that the government can't give favorable treatment to religion. Constitutionally, these restrictions on large gatherings have to be in the interest of protecting the public, and they can't target houses of worship. That's important to remember. But just as like churches have to abide by building codes, the same codes that apply to community centers or banks, they also have to abide by public health orders. When the government does grant religious accommodations or exceptions to laws, the government can't do so at the expense of harming others. And this is incredibly important. There's a limiting or a balancing test to religious freedom in this country. The principle of separation of religion and government, or church and state, prohibits religious exemptions from COVID-19 mass gathering restrictions, because doing so would undermine efforts to contain the spread of the coronavirus and put everyone in harm's way. And the other constitutional principle that's in play here is, as I've said, the government has a mandate. It's not just about not targeting houses of worship. It's also about a mandate to include houses of worship in these bans, because the Constitution makes very clear that the government has to protect public health through appropriate measures, even when some people may have religious objections. Religious freedom is not the right to harm others. This is the core principle that AU operates under. These limits and balancing tests, that is what's most important to remember in this moment, that your religious freedom ends at the point at which you begin to harm others. So here in Minnesota, or there in Minnesota, Governor Walz has, you have some gathering bans in place. You also have one of those stay-at-home orders in place that I referenced as one of the 3 mechanisms. And your stay-home order contains an exemption for what's called critical sectors, and it allows people employed in critical sectors to leave home. And in Minnesota, critical sectors does include religious workers who need to leave home to tend to the sick and the dying, or to travel to their churches to broadcast their virtual services. AU doesn't object to this, and we think that this is constitutional because it's treating religious leaders like everyone else whose work requires them to leave home right now. But so as states are starting to open up, we are starting to see some preferential treatment for houses of worship. And a really great example is your neighbors to the south in Iowa. They have a new order in place as the state and the governor aim to open up businesses and allow some small gatherings, but at lower capacities and with some restrictions in place. But in Iowa, the new executive order explicitly exempts churches and allows them to hold mass gatherings while scientists or AU members or the Reason community could not gather in the same way. So this is one example of that kind of preferential treatment that violates separation of religion and government and puts us all in harm's way. As we know, viruses don't respect state borders. And so what's happening to the neighboring states impacts Minnesotans as well. I've mentioned that the area where AU has been especially engaged is in the states here. We have written letters to about 8 states, helping to clarify the constitutional obligations and limitations for governors and other state lawmakers. We are active in the courts as well. We've filed more than 11, a friend of court brief, an amicus brief. And in these briefs, we're arguing against challengers who are seeking these religious exemptions to these COVID-19 orders. And again, there is this critical balancing test that I want to come back to about the obligation of the government to protect the health of all, that religious freedom doesn't allow you to abide by no laws at all, and to exempt yourself from laws that are neutrally applicable and protect the health and the well-being of everyone. One thing that we're really interested in or keeping our eye on for the future is what it looks like as states continue to open up. I mentioned Iowa, and we'll be really looking at how states around the country reopen and whether or not they're jeopardizing public health and public safety to appease religious extremists by giving them those preferential treatments. And one thing that I, as a person who's lived in the South and the Midwest, in small communities, in smaller states, is really keeping my eye on is how local governments are responding when hotspots pop up. As we know, in the course of this virus, it's likely over the next year that there will be moments of resurgence and that they're likely to be local resurgences. And we can assume that if state lawmakers are really struggling to get it right, that local lawmakers who are often operating with good intentions, but much fewer resources and less constitutional expertise, are more likely to cave to demands of local religious extremists, whether or not they're constitutional. And on that note, I would like to say that we want to hear from you. If you go to au.org, there's a little button that says report a violation, and we want to know what's happening in local communities, especially as things are reopening, as hotspots pop up, and how we can help you at the local level protect separation of religion and government. Sort of changing gears a little bit, talking about the stimulus bill, which is another really important aspect of separation of religion and government that we have been tracking as part of pandemic response. And it's about fundamentally the use of government funding. You have seen recently that you may have seen this news headline. It was just this week, I think. Franklin Graham, who is the son of Billy Graham, although he has much sort of more radically conservative views than Billy Graham did even. He and his charity set up a tent hospital in New York City. They explicitly said, as they were advertising for volunteers, that they would only accept Christian volunteers. This tent hospital was funded through the public health system with money that was coming from taxpayers. And the tent hospital was making volunteers sign a statement of belief that applies a really narrow set of fundamentalist Christian beliefs, saying that any volunteer must agree to believe and live by the principles of the charity. That was recently shut down. New Yorkers had a real outcry around this use of their taxpayer dollars, and the tent hospital has recently shut down. But the issue that AU has really been tracking and most engaged on is about specifically the money coming out of the stimulus package. So you're familiar with the CARES Act. It was there's been 4, I think, at this point, stimulus bills. And the CARES Act included something called the Paycheck Protection Project or Program. PPP is what we call it. And it allows small businesses and nonprofits to take out loans that cover payroll. But it allows the government to forgive those loans after a set period of time. So it essentially converts a loan into a grant. And houses of worship were neither explicitly included or excluded in that program. But we know that giving churches or synagogues and mosques or other houses of worship government grants to pay the salaries of their faith leaders or to support worship is a violation, a clear violation of separation of religion and government. And I want to note that this is a really tough issue to talk about, and it can feel uncomfortable. I'm a Quaker. I'm a member of a very small religious community. We are having to think very deeply about how do we pay the salaries of our staff. We don't have paid clergy, but we have a childcare worker, we have a groundskeeper of our building. How are we going to continue to pay them as so many members of our small community have lost their jobs and their income? It's a really difficult question, but it's a conversation that we have to have. It's unprecedented, like utterly unprecedented in the history of our nation, that our government is implementing a widespread program that's diverting millions of dollars, taxpayer dollars, to fund religious worship and the salary of clergies. And I really think that it's worth taking a step back and considering the implications. It's a conversation that we can have with compassion for the suffering, for people wondering how they're going to feed their children if they work at a house of worship. But I still think it's a conversation worthy of having. Restrictions on government funding, the reason that that's in our Constitution comes from the Virginia Religious Freedom Statute, which was entirely about taxing people to pay the salary of clergies. These prohibitions, or what we now have in the First Amendment, is about protecting the conscience of the individual taxpayer, as was the case in Virginia. It's also about safeguarding the autonomy of religious institutions. Once you start taking government money, you're opening yourself up to government scrutiny in a way that many churches find alarming. That's why that separation exists. And it also ensures an equal playing field for all religions. Separation of religion and government, it is the promise that the Constitution makes. And we hold it in good times and in bad times, even when that conversation is hard to have. So I would encourage you to start that conversation with folks you love. We can do that with compassion. We can ask important questions about this historic moment and the step that we're taking that's likely to have consequences, especially because we don't know who the next administration will be and what is the precedent that we're setting in our country. I'm not going to talk much about vouchers, but I wanted to note this is an issue you may not have heard of. It's very recent that Education Secretary Betsy DeVos recently inserted a bucket of money in the most recent stimulus package that diverts about $180 million towards a program she's calling micro grants. They're vouchers. They're private school vouchers that funnel public money into private schools. And, quite frankly, Betsy DeVos is exploiting this public health crisis to promote her private school voucher agenda. We think that this is particularly galling in this moment of pandemic, when we know our public educators are really stepping up to be creative educators of our nation's children, and that these private school voucher programs are often unaccountable, ineffective, according to the data, and they allow discrimination against children and their families, against LGBTQ children, and they are also inadequately serving and underserving students with disabilities as well. This is a religious freedom issue because it moves taxpayer money into funding religious education, and it's an issue that AU has advocated on since our founding in the 1940s. So that's a little bit about what's happening in the context of pandemic and COVID response and the issues that are popping up. I'd love to open it up to my colleague, Dina, to either add anything that I may have missed, or to take a step back, to take us out of pandemic response and give us a bigger overview of what's been happening over the course of the Trump administration in the last 3.5 years as it relates to separation of religion and government.
Thanks, Sarah. That was a great, quick tour of what's going on in COVID response. And I will talk about the Trump administration attacks on religious freedom. Doing so in less than 3 hours is surely a daunting task. So I'll go fast. And let's just start with what happened yesterday, because, every day is a new day. First up, the Senate Judiciary Committee held a hearing yesterday, not on how to respond to the pandemic, but on a judicial nominee. Justin Walker is a protege of Mitch McConnell, and for 6 months has served as a federal district court judge in Kentucky. In April, President Trump nominated him to fill a vacancy on a federal appeals court for Washington, D.C., which is one of the most important courts in the country. The thing is, the seat is not even vacant until September. So the hearing seemed a little premature. And just after he was nominated, Judge Justin Walker wrote an opinion in a case brought by the On Fire Christian Center in Louisville, Kentucky, to challenge one of the state emergency orders that Sarah just talked about. The church filed the case on Good Friday, and less than 24 hours later, Judge Walker issued a 20-page opinion with 86 footnotes. A lot. The opinion was overwrought and included references to his personal religious beliefs, but it was also very political, and I'm going to explain why. First, he began by recounting the history of religious persecution from Nero to more recent times. And by that, I mean, he compared policies that ensure women have access to contraception and that LGBTQ customers don't face discrimination from businesses to Nero, and to African-American slaves being flogged for attending religious gatherings, and admissions policies at Harvard University that discriminated against Jews. And ultimately, he compared, without so saying, he was obviously comparing these bans, mass gathering bans, to the same sort of religious persecution. He seems to think, based on that opinion and other things he's written, that the free exercise clause should offer limitless protections from these state-sponsored persecutions, and doesn't even account for the establishment clause limits. And needless to say that these issues are currently and still being litigated in federal courts across the country. So we all know what his views are, should he have to decide anything in the future. And if that weren't enough, at the end of the decision, he claims to be characterizing the beliefs of the importance of Easter to the church that brought the challenge. But he doesn't rely on anything the church said in any of its court filings. Rather, he uses his own language, and it reads like a very deeply personal statement of beliefs. He even uses the first person plural pronoun at some point. And that crosses the line for sure. Importantly, though, he ruled in favor of the church and said the city of Louisville couldn't stop it from holding drive-in services on Easter. Yet, the city of Louisville never actually said it would intervene. It tried to discourage drive-in services because the services that the On Fire Church had previously held didn't adhere to the social distancing guidelines, even from their cars. But the city didn't say it would stop the church. In his haste to write his lengthy, rhetorical, religious-infused decision, he didn't even contact the city for a response. And ultimately, as I said earlier, it's all political, because he knew he would soon have a hearing on his nomination. So he wrote an opinion that many from one side would love and that would hamstring any critics. If you asked him whether his own beliefs about the importance to Easter contributed to his hasty, unnecessary decision, you'd be accused of criticizing him because he's a Christian and imposing a religious test on a judicial seat. So the minute I read it, I thought, well, goodness, that's his get out of jail free card. He's not going to be able to be asked any questions about this. Walker, of course, is just one of dozens and dozens and dozens of federal judges Trump and McConnell have pushed through. Many of them have equally troubling views and equally troubling past rulings on the separation of religion and government. And this includes, obviously, Justice Gorsuch and Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. And that brings us to the other thing that happened yesterday. The Supreme Court heard arguments in a case called Pennsylvania v. Trump. It's a case challenging the Trump administration regulations, which allow employers and universities to invoke religious or moral beliefs to withhold insurance coverage for contraception from employees and students. The objecting companies and universities don't even have to take the simple step of stating their objection in writing, which would allow that coverage to be provided through other means. So these women and their families and others are completely left holding the, paying for it on their own. Thanks to birth control benefit of the ACA, an estimated 62 million people have been able to access birth control coverage with no additional cost. And we all know that contraception is critical to women's and others' health and equality. Should the court allow the Trump administration policy to stand, tens of thousands of people would lose access to contraception, even though the ACA guarantees that their health insurance must cover it. Justices Ginsburg and Sotomayor focused on how important birth control is and how people will be harmed if they have to go purchase it on their own. Cost is a major determinant whether people obtain healthcare and they need the healthcare they need across income spectrum, but particularly for people in lower incomes. When finances are scarce, people stop using birth control altogether or use it inconsistently. Yet most of the justices didn't spend any time considering this issue. These 2018 regulations have been challenged from the get-go and now are finally before the Supreme Court. AU and allies brought a case on behalf of Notre Dame students. So we represented the Notre Dame students in our amicus brief at the Supreme Court. And so now we have to wait until the summer to see what they decide. There are many more ways the Trump administration is using the guise of religious freedom to allow discrimination in healthcare. Last May, the Trump administration announced what we call the denial of care rule, which invites healthcare workers or even hospitals to deny care to any patient, and even in emergency situations, on the basis of religious beliefs. We've filed 2 of the many lawsuits across the country challenging these dangerous rules. And just last week, HHS announced it was moving forward and finalizing a rule that would remove anti-discrimination protections for gender identity and sex stereotyping from the regulations implementing the non-discrimination provision of the ACA. These rules would also create a religious exemption from sex discrimination provisions for all religious hospitals and insurance plans. So even in this time of health crisis, the administration is looking for ways to essentially take away healthcare from people. And it's not just healthcare. The Trump administration's regulations may even unravel the social safety net. In January, 9 agencies announced new regulations that govern how the government partners with faith-based organizations to deliver social services. As you know, many faith-based organizations have long partnered with the government to provide important social services for people in need and haven't needed these rules to do it successfully. But the proposed rules would strip away religious freedom protections from vulnerable and marginalized people who use government-funded services. They would lead to the beneficiaries not getting the services they need. And the people who will likely face the most harm are religious minorities and the non-religious, women, LGBTQ people. They put the interests of the taxpayer-funded organizations, some of which receive millions of dollars a year, ahead of the needs of the people that they are supposed to serve. And just a few other examples. The Trump administration in November, the Trump administration announced a rule that would strip critical protections against discrimination on the basis of religion, sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity from federally funded HHS social service programs. It would allow taxpayer-funded social service providers to turn away people in need. And this was the administration's, so stripping all of these protections away was the way that the administration responded to criticism it faced for allowing foster care agencies in South Carolina to deny loving homes by turning away parents and volunteers who are the wrong religion. We are representing a woman named Amy Madonna, who's a mother of 3 who was turned away by a foster care agency because she's Catholic. And last year, the Trump administration announced a rule that would gut regulations barring discrimination against transgender people in HUD-funded homeless shelters. And again, religion is one of the reasons why they could turn people away. This is not all, but it is enough. You get the picture. The Trump administration has engaged in assault on religious freedom. I don't need to tell you that religious freedom is fundamental. It gives us the right to believe or not as we see fit, but it doesn't give anyone the right to harm others or discriminate. The Trump administration is trying to turn religious freedom, which is a shield, into a sword. Ultimately, this harms the vital principle that protects us all. We've been busy, and we appreciate that every one of you has been watchful, provided comments on these regulations, supported orgs like yours and ours who spend a lot of time focused on this. So thank you very much, and keep it up. We still have some work to do.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Dina. Just a reminder to people who are watching online to submit questions if you have them. I've got a few here to start the ball rolling. Got a couple of questions about the religious preference or preference for religions in mass gathering orders. One is, I hear letters and briefs are being submitted against this preference. Are there any lawsuits? The other one is, did you by any chance see a recent commentary by Noah Feldman in Bloomberg News, who more or less said Virginia should back off on its restriction of religious gatherings for fear that if it went to court, we'd lose the battle and it would set a bad precedent. So, Sarah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I might defer to Dina on this one.
Okay.
She is a barred attorney and I am not an attorney. So I play one on TV occasionally, but I want to make sure we get the law right on this one.
So let me see if I can remember. I'll probably go to there are lawsuits being filed across the country. So I mentioned one when I talked about John Walker in Louisville. There's some in Lodi, California, and several in California. And I'm not going to remember where they all are now. Mississippi, I think. And it's often it's mostly the churches who are challenging the restrictions that are in place, the neutral restrictions that are in place. And so we have filed, we did one in Kansas. In fact, we file amicus briefs explaining that the neutral bans there's no free exercise requirement to lift the neutral ban as to churches. And in fact, the Establishment Clause means that you can't create exemptions that would cause harm to others. And doing so in this instance could cause harm, as we've all seen examples of hotspots developing out of houses of worship and religious gatherings.
And I do think maybe part of that question is also, why are there not lawsuits on the other side, right? And
yeah.
Part of that is like also, the courts.
Right, it's the courts, and it's, as Professor Feldman pointed out, it's not, it's a risky proposition, right? Right now, the courts are a little dicey, and the Trump administration has had, President Trump has had the opportunity to put in, I may be exaggerating, but like 200 federal judges. Is that possible? I couldn't possibly keep track. It's like, it feels like every day. But yeah, it's hard. And then there's also just, regular sort of boring things like, does somebody have the right to bring a lawsuit? Do they have standing to go to court and make a complaint? So that's a little harder when the harm is sort of amorphous. So I think there are, technical and practical reasons.
Thanks. I've got a question about the birth control case that was heard, oral arguments were heard yesterday. And the question is, if SCOTUS upholds this policy, what types of things do you see fitting the definition of moral objections? And will SCOTUS define what religions can take advantage of this ruling? Do you see a favorable Trump ruling leading to religious discrimination in areas beyond birth control?
Lots of good questions. I think, so moral, it's interesting. It's not, there are exemptions in the law already that say religious and moral, you can, if you have a religious or moral objection, you can get an exemption. There hasn't been a lot of time spent by courts trying to define what moral is. In general, if you think about the conscientious objection cases from the Vietnam War, the Supreme Court allowed someone who was not religious but had moral objections to participating in the war. And so we look back at that case and think that that defines that moral has to be sort of the equivalent of what religion is for a religious person, like very deep to their being. I don't think, we try not to suggest that it is limitless, because otherwise it could be limitless. And I don't think that that's what a court would allow, actually, if it came to litigation. And then it's not about a particular faiths, rather it's about the anyone who claims a religious objection to providing certain types of birth control. So it's not, right now, the whole, all FDA approved methods of birth control are supposed to be provided under the insurance plan. Most people object to Plan B and to IUDs. And so you don't have to be a member of a specific religion. You don't have to, you don't have to be Catholic, because I'm just, not to pick on Catholics, but we kind of know where their teachings are. And you don't have to say that it's central to your church's beliefs. It's what you personally, as the business owner or the head of the organization, believe. Did I hit all of them?
And
Sorry.
I think on the last bit of that question of like, what else does this mean? And that is one of the concerns, right? Like, what does it mean when we open the door to universities and employers getting to decide what workers and students, what healthcare they get? What does it mean for trans people? What does it mean for women? What does it mean for people who need other kinds of healthcare that their boss may have religious objections to? And the fundamental point that religious freedom means that an individual gets to make their own healthcare decisions in accordance with the medicine and the science, but also their own moral, religious, and sort of conscience beliefs, right? Our bosses and our schools don't get to make those choices for us.
Okay, thank you. Got a question about the CARES Act. Is there a constitutional way to pay workers, daycare providers at places of worship and exclude the actual clergy? Or does that go down a road leading to a slippery slope?
I would say that it could be done. It's not without some complication, but I think that the Establishment Clause at its core ensures that we don't support religious activities, and the people at houses of worship who are most associated with, facilitating the religious activities are the people who lead the worship leaders. And I think that if you could say that the loans would be available to houses of worship and the loan forgiveness would be available for uses except for the people who are defined as worship leaders within their own, within that faith. So that could be done. It is not simple.
Yeah, and that's sort of my greater point of like, it's a complicated conversation, but it's one that's worth having. There may be ways forward there, but what we have done and what the administration in particular has done is to just ignore entirely the concern and the real constitutional issues and the precedent that they're setting without initiating a conversation about if there is a third way or not. And so that sort of recklessness about such an important piece of our Constitution is alarming and worthy of our time right now.
Okay, I have a question that perhaps Terry Nelson of ACLU could respond. Is your connection such that you can hear us, Terry?
Yep, I can hear you.
Oh, great. This is regarding emergency orders restricting activity. What are the legal red flags that they are crossing into unnecessarily authoritarian, or I suppose we could say violating civil liberties?
That is a really great question. I think a couple things. First of all, a red flag for me is when enforcement is actually counterproductive to the goal. And we see this with criminal penalties for example, for violating the stay-at-home order, or in some states we're seeing criminal penalties for people not wearing masks. And first of all, criminal penalties often fall disproportionately on Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. We know that they're going to face enforcement and charges more often given patterns of policing. But the other thing is that arresting and jailing people during a pandemic is really antithetical to protecting public health, because COVID-19 in jail facilities is, once it enters a facility, it will spread like wildfire. And so it makes no sense to put somebody in jail for failing to socially distance, or for failing to maintain physical distancing. We also know that public health measures work best when they engender trust and voluntary compliance rather than punitive approaches. And so when you have these punitive approaches, that to me is a red flag. Certainly there might be some times when voluntary compliance is not happening, and you may have to, in extreme circumstances, take punitive measures, but the focus should be on voluntary compliance.
Okay. I have a question about abortion that maybe Yuval and Kelli could address. There was an article in the New York Times this morning that said that a lot of young people who ordinarily might favor the Democrats will stick with Trump specifically and exclusively because of their anti-abortion stance. And the article didn't mention it, but I would guess that most of those young people who were interviewed come from evangelical families or from religious traditions that are very anti-abortion. So these are people who, might be considered to go Democratic otherwise, but they're sticking to Republicans because of that one issue. So I'm just wondering what the solution to that is. Kelli?
Well, the way that I would address that is that poll after poll after poll after poll shows that a majority of Americans, and certainly a majority of Minnesotans, are in favor of less restriction on access to abortion. So I think if there's if the goal to get that smaller demographic is to water down our belief that women and people should have access to a full range of reproductive health care because it is a public health good, if we're basing this on numbers and reason and science, access to a full range of reproductive health care is a public health good, then I don't think it behooves us to water that down. The anti-choice movement, and I use that phrase very carefully, the anti-choice movement is completely driven by ideology and religion. I don't doubt that there are some people who are anti-choice who are non-religious. That's certainly possible, but there's no movement for it that is non-religious. And so as we're thinking about this, that is the clear separation to me. And I'm not sure that group is worth reaching for, because the movement for reproductive health rights and justice has had to move more to the center and more to the center, so that, you know, for many years it was like saying, I can't say that I'm pro-abortion, safe, legal, and rare. We don't use that language anymore. And I am glad to say that I am pro-abortion. I want it to be available by professional providers in communities without stigma, in the same way that I am pro heart transplant and pro knee replacement and pro all the things that help people have a better life. So that's what I say about that. I'll preach if you want me to. I'll preach about it.
Yuval, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would love to. I think what this brings up for me is how, I mean, first of all, I haven't read the article, so I want to preface all of this with that. Is from what it sounds like with the article, is that folks are, you know, the folks that are being interviewed, like, are coming from like a very specific background, but it's not being like explicit about it, right? Where it's like, oh, all these young people, it's like, oh yeah, all these millennials or whatever, yeah, totally on board with Trump. What? Anyways, so it's a thing of just like already being purposefully misleading by excluding like certain facts, whatever, right? But I think what particularly stands out to me is this sort of history of the reproductive freedom movement overall, is that it's always kind of been on the back foot, right? It's always responding, it's always reacting. And until like very recently, and I don't want to say it's, oh, our campaign's the first, but our campaign is one of the first, right? Where it's about providing a totally different framework to work with that has been hugely inspired by the reproductive justice movement, right? Where, how do I want to describe this? It's far more of a thing of like, we can actually be affirmative about making sure that people are getting the healthcare that they need. And that includes abortion, that includes birth control, that includes so many other things, right? And whereas like, instead of starting the fight at, oh, when does life begin or whatever, we've been framing it at when somebody decides to have an abortion, right? Like, somebody's already made the decision. This is what we use in all of our campaign messaging. So it becomes necessary to start it there, so we don't end up in the weeds of moral arguments that are ultimately just different ways of viewing, like, maybe different scriptures, whether or not you're reading the same sort of things, right? And then again, it gets to the point where it's like you end up ultimately privileging one religion over everything else. So I think that's how I would kind of respond to that, is making sure that you have an affirmative stance on reproductive healthcare, as well as like you're setting the tone and the pace of whatever argument you might end up getting into, right? An argument doesn't necessarily mean like screamy yelly, right? It's just like, no, we need to talk about this and we need to actually have a debate about it, and we're going to be right.
Okay, I've got two final questions and then our time is just about up. One is from Rebecca Thoman. Are you aware of the administration's waiver of the Patient Self-Determination Act during the pandemic that requires hospitals to inform patients about their legal right to accept or refuse medical treatment? Is that something you've been following, Dina or Sarah?
No.
Okay.
It's not. I wonder, yeah, we haven't been following that at all. In fact,
Okay.
I guess there's too much to follow.
Okay. Then we have one from Trevor. Since the administration relabeled churches as small businesses to qualify for bailout money, how does that change any legal approach to taxation of churches? I guess that would be for Sarah or Dina.
Yeah, it's a good question. The CARES Act, this portion, the PPP of the CARES Act, is meant to be very temporary, and they are not permanent changes to the rules of the SBA. So They are allowing nonprofits and include houses of worship within nonprofits to qualify for loans that they wouldn't ordinarily qualify for. But I think after the PPP program is wrapped up, that won't be the case anymore. So there shouldn't really be an effect on taxation and issues like that, just because it's very temporary in nature. Obviously, we'll be watching if temporary becomes a little bit longer term.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Afraid our time is up. I want to thank all of our speakers for making the effort to be with us at a time when the need for government policy to be based on science and evidence is more critical than ever. Thanks also to our viewers who cared enough to tune in today. We hope you'll follow up by contacting your state and congressional representatives to ask them to stand up for secular values. There's a link at the bottom of the page that you are on that will provide contact information for all of your representatives. And we'll be sending an email as well to guide you on that. And thanks to Secular North for providing the platform for this live event. And that's it. Thanks, everybody, and stay well.